I guess it's going to be the summer of the Eastern Front for me. I'm going to take a look now at a game called Fury in the East. And this covers the opening of the German-Soviet War, from the initial invasion through to the first winter of 1942. This is a magazine game from Multi-Man Publishing. This magazine was presented about 10 years ago. Well, 8 years ago, summer of 2010. And it's part of their International Game series, as this game was originally presented by a Japanese designer. They, I think, reworked it a little bit. And I thought I'd take a look at it because it does cover the same ground as the previous game, Storm in the East. I just wanted to sort of compare how these two different systems went about looking at this same conflict. So as is typical with magazine games, it's a pretty sparse package. There's the rules insert, nice, die-cut counter sheet, and then the map. I'll take a look at the map first. The map is kind of presented north to south. It's sort of tall, the west side being here, with just the area of East Prussia, Poland, and Romania presented, and then the east side here, going just to the east of Moscow, up there in the center. But being such a long map, you're going to probably have players on both sides, looking at it from this direction rather than head on here. It does cover all the ground from the Crimea all the way up to Leningrad in the north, and the parts of Finland that would be in play. Though the parts of Finland are actually very small, which is probably fitting. Going in for a closer look, I think it is a really kind of a nice looking map. It has some important things put on it for play purposes, but also just some things that are good to look at. The typical swampland there. There are some roads, primary and secondary. And then the cities are pretty well represented, as well as the sort of heavy terrain of the forests. And one thing I don't know is what the scale of these hexes is. I think I could, figure it out just by taking some well-known points like here to here. I bet Google Maps would tell me how far that is, but still, it's, a little odd that it's not printed in the rule book. The game is split into 10 turns. Each turn represents about a month. And there are some charts here for weather, as that is randomly determined by die roll, and that'll affect play quite a bit. There's a full sheet of die-cut counters. A few down here are errata for other games, but for the most part these are all for this game. Two-sided. And they're kind of the standard half-inch size counter. Taking a closer look, these are some Soviet counters, and they're kind of some generic tank corps, rifle corps counters. When they start getting into the guards, you'll start to see some unit designations on them. A lot of headquarter units for the Soviets. And kind of as per usual, the Germans get all their unit designations on all their counters. But they are fairly uniform. Most of the infantry corps are the same qualities. Most of the panzers are as well. And the Germans also have their minor allies represented. Romanians, the Finnish, and I think that's Hungarian and Italian. But you're in for some fun when you have counters of Hitler yelling. Those are actually really important counters. They're going to determine a lot of the flow of the game and determine victory. For the Soviets, it's the reverse side of those generic leader counters, or headquarter counters, to reveal the leaders. And these are really critical for the Soviets to play effectively. And air power is represented, and hey, I get some Stukas represented on the counters. The rules are only 12 pages, but they're kind of tightly packed. There's plenty of things in here to distinguish the game. And the final page is just the reinforcement schedule, so there are no player aid cards, but this really is your player aid card right there. So after that quick look, I'll get the counters cut out. Go ahead and get the game set up and take a look at how it plays. So here's a typical setup. There are a lot of counters to place at the outset. The Soviets have the added wrinkle in that while many of the rifle and tank corps seemingly are the same, some of them are actually weaker than others. The specific size will yield their reduced strength. Some of them are two-step, some are one. Some of the two-step units have a lesser value when they're reduced. So what that means is you must draw randomly from an opaque container while you're placing units. So when a hex calls for a rifle corps, you reach into the cup, pick one out randomly, and put it down. So when you're setting up the game, you actually don't know what your force dispersal is or what your strengths are. It's not until you start to actually play, move, or combat that you reveal these things. The same is true for all these Soviet headquarters units. Flips them over and they become specific leaders with specific abilities. But until you get there, you have to use a cup, draw them at random when you place them. And I think the developer referred to this as a 3-cup system. 1 cup for leaders, 1 cup for tank corps, and 1 cup for rifle corps. So it made it kind of a little slow and tedious to set up. Germans were simpler, of course. They just grouped into their areas, then placed them down within those areas as you see fit. There's only one bit of uniqueness about the setup. I don't know if it's a setup really, but this one area here is the southwest front for the Soviet, and you have a set of forces you can set up there. But they are limited in what they can do in the first couple turns. I would call that the first of the strident leader rules that are applied to the game. This is Stalin saying you're not going to give up any ground, so they're restricted to that area. But the others, after they set up, they'll be able to move freely. In many ways, this is a fairly conventional game. It has a lot of the standard features you expect to see. First among those is a sequence of play divided into phases and divided into sort of 2-player sides. First the Axis, move, combat, those kind of things, and then when they're complete, the Soviets get to move, combat, and so on. But the wrinkle is that is in effect for the first 6 turns, I believe. So basically like the first 2/3 of the game, the Axis move first. Then for the last third of the game, it switches, and then the Soviets actually are the first player for the turn, and they conduct their phases before the Axis. So it's kind of a nifty little way to show the changing fortunes of war and the slipping away of the initiative from the Axis and then going back over to the Soviets. Another standard trope is the zone of control. 6 surrounding hexes. They are locking. They stop movement, but also prevent exiting an enemy zone of control, so you can't move away from them. But there's a wrinkle. These are Soviet leader counters on their specific side. Well, I won't reveal that. Here's one. On a specific side, it has a range of 1. Soviet units must be within range of a leader in order to have their full capabilities. If they are not, then they have what is called a limited zone of control, and German panzer units can ignore it and move right, into and past those limited zones of control. So it makes those leader counters very important for the Soviets. Another typical feature is supply. It's generally just a trace mechanism. For the axis that goes to the east, or the west map edge here, they have to trace what's called a line of communication, and it can extend through railroad hexes and roads, anything that's not impassable to movement. For the axis, it's going to be specifically railroad hexes on the western map edge. And for the Soviets, it's the starred hexes on the eastern map edge. The effect of out of supply is on movement and combat. There's no attrition, no step loss. If you're not in supply or with a line of communication, you move at half your rate, and you suffer a penalty on the combat resolution. But there's a wrinkle. The axes are further limited by proximity to these Army group supply heads, they're called. Here's one for north, here's one for center, there's one for south. So in order to conduct combat at maximum effectiveness, they must be within range of one of these supply heads. So it means that you're going to have only a few limited avenues of advance within range of those supply heads. I really think of this more of a command thing than supply, but whatever. They can call it whatever they want. And of course there's movement. There are specifically 3 types of movement, so I might call there's a 4th, but there is a very specific order in which these are undertaken, and the implications are kind of clear. The first is a rail movement. You can kind of make out that there are these railroad tracks, and you can move units across those railroad tracks, a maximum of 2 for the Axis, I think 5 for the Soviets, as long as you don't start or end in an enemy zone of control. After that, there is strategic movement. If the first is rail movement, this is really road movement. The idea is that if you move along roads, you get a better rate, you can move, effectively double your movement. But again, you can't move into a zone of control. And the third type of movement is normal, and that is essentially combat movement. You are moving units into enemy zones of control with the purpose of engaging in combat. A special case is overrun, where you can, attack while you're moving, and as long as you have movement points, you can continue attacking. But the 4th type is movement of these Axis supply heads, and that specifically occurs at the very start of the turn, according to the rules. That means these supply heads and strategic and rail movement are really lagging movement. You're going to move them in the next turn based on what you accomplish in the current turn. So you bring forces up, they can't fight, you engage with your normal movement, and then the other forces can then move, hopefully, they get a chance in the next turn. Combat is also pretty straightforward. You have combat factors, total them up, attack versus defense, create a ratio, odds-based combat results table, roll the die, and apply the results. Now, there are a couple of wrinkles. First wrinkle is each side has its own combat result table. The Axis combat result table is kind of heavy on losses, but no retreats. And it's just the opposite for the Soviet. They are a little lighter on losses, but they inflict more retreats on the Axis. The other bit of a wrinkle is that Axis forces may voluntarily attack in their turn the Soviet forces, whereas the Soviets must attack any Axis in their zone of control. So to me, that's another one of those crazy leader rules. Stalin insists on attacking active, combat war, and you must attack. No playing rope-a-dope and retreating and giving up ground. So as a Soviet player, you can rack up some losses because you're forced to undertake attacks, but the CRT for the Soviets is a little more forgiving, so it's not really quite that bad for them. Both sides receive reinforcements, but only Soviets receive replacements that they can use to either bring reduced units up to strength or rebuild those from the dead pile. And they get them from their leaders. The leaders have these 2 numbers. The left one is their command. That's used for a variety of things, including a replacement number. So Konev can generate 2 replacements, where this fella can generate 0. So based on that, they can draw or replenish units at the end of the turn. We play to win the game, and the burden of victory is on the Axis in this game. They can win a immediate victory if they ever capture Moscow and control it. And control means being able to trace a line of communication back to the west edge. Otherwise, they stock up victory points by capturing cities which are given different values based on their importance, as well as by eliminating Soviet leaders. They also lose victory points for casualties they incur, losses of their forces, and also failure to achieve objectives, put upon them by, the high command. So at the end of the game, the Axis totals up all their victory point awards, all their deductions, and finds a final number, and then they compare it to a chart and figure out who wins the game. But there's a wrinkle. The Hitler command. You may think you have a brilliant plan to win the war, but oh, how wrong you would be. The Axis player has to start rolling a die at the end of every turn to set the objective for the next turn that he has to hit. And that is in the form of these Hitler commands. And there's tables for different phases of the game. And essentially, at the end of the turn, you have to flip over the Hitler command counter and figure out if you achieve that victory objective. If you don't, you subtract victory points. So you can be losing victory points turn after turn based on the changing nature of these commands. You may be forced to go in a completely different direction than you were the previous turn. So it makes it pretty challenging to try to keep up with your own plan with the vagaries of the high command in the rear changing things on a whim. I kind of like this mechanic and the effect it has. Do you try to satisfy Der Fuhrer by going after these objectives as they potentially change from turn to turn? Or do you say, to heck with it, I'll take the victory point losses because I'm going to try to capture Moscow and win an immediate victory? So it gives you, the player, some interesting things to think about, different things to try, and it also keeps it fresh from game to game because these will not necessarily reveal themselves in the same order every time. For the most part, I think the game is pretty clean. The only errata that I've noticed is really on the Soviet leader counters. The HQ, the Q, is kind of upside down and backwards. A little tail at the top. Otherwise, the counter, the map, most of the rules are clear enough, without any obvious mistakes. But that said, there really is kind of a large amount of clarifications on the game that arose from questions and answers in different wargame forums. Most of the discussion really is just making rules, intents clear, but a couple of things came up that were important, one of which was the Overrun Rules. In the rules as written, it makes it sound as if you just move adjacent to someone, attack, and then just keep moving. And the clarifications pointed out that it actually requires 3 movement points to conduct an attack, so you don't get them for free. You will make, probably at most 2 overrun attacks, whereas from the rules as they existed, it seemed like you could go a long way. But otherwise, it was a lot of clarification of edge cases and reinforcing of concepts, or, just some people might have been a little confused about. It didn't really change my experience or perception of the game at all. So how does it play? Well, it is a pretty straightforward, panzer-pushing kind of game. There's no operational strategic planning. You're in the moment, and much of what happens in this turn is all that concerns you. Future turns kind of take care of themselves. But it does have some pretty interesting and distinguishing features that I think really help it a lot. One that I really like and I appreciate is the structure of the movement phases. You have to perform your rear area movements before your front line movements. And it kind of, it really emphasizes that idea that it's slower to get rear area forces into the fight. So there's no such thing as like performing an overrun attack, blowing a hole open, and then strategic marching someone, hundreds of kilometers into the rear. You have to perform those kinds of things, with the next turn in mind, not necessarily with the current turn. I like the effect of the Axis supply heads and the Soviet leaders, the way they kind of concentrate a form of command. There's some aspects of the Soviet leaders I think is a little cumbersome and confusing. Maybe they were trying to do too many things within the game. There's this thing called a leader pool I didn't even touch on because it still causes me to scratch my head a little. but I like the effects it has overall in making it harder to manage the forces effectively, that these are valuable resources. And I think the crazy leader effects are just enough. The Soviet effects are a little more subtle in the requirement that they attack and in some of the retreat restrictions in the South, whereas the Hitler presentation is a little more direct with the Hitler command rules and how it can jumble up your victory conditions and victory goals from turn to turn. That makes it pretty interesting for both sides to try to manage those things. This might be an in-between game, like a little too much detail for some people, but not quite enough for others. They might be left a little cold by it, but I think it achieves, a perspective on this campaign that's pretty effective, and it plays, reasonably quickly. So I found that to be a pretty interesting counterpoint to the Storm in the East game, which was more operational, in forward-thinking planning, whereas this is much of a straightforward, Panzerfest kind of game. So we had Storm in the East, Fury in the East. Hopefully before the summer concludes, I might even get Thunder in the East on the table if that makes it out in time.